IVM.
He is a multi-potentialite at large, founder, policy wonk, activist, op-ed columnist. He's also been given the tag of our very own Desi Indiana Jones meets James Bond, who's been snooping around the world to bring back Indian archaeological artifacts taken out during the colonial era under his project called the Indian Pride Project. He also believes that data, when backed by facts, can become a different story and started datareveals.org. He's a very, very well sought out thought leader when it comes to policy, and especially in today's world when geopolitics is playing a much, much important role in the world. He is one of those friends of India representing our flag. Yes, he still has an Indian passport. So without further ado, please welcome my friend Anurag Saxena on the Vishal Gondal show. Welcome, Anurag. How are you doing?
Oh, Vishal, it's always been a pleasure hanging out with you. And now it's an honor to actually be on your show and chat about things that we really care about. So thanks for having me, boss.
No, but there is a very interesting thing which all the listeners should know, that the last meeting I actually had before the first lockdown, which happened in India, was with with Anurag, when he literally was in India. He came to my office. So why don't you narrate that story, Anurag? It was quite an adventure we had.
Oh, in fact, I'll narrate the pre-adventure and the adventure. So I was in India for a week and a few days, and on the plan was to reach on a Thursday and leave the next Sunday. If you remember, we met on the Saturday. Now Saturday morning, I start getting phone calls saying that, hey, listen, something is happening and blah blah blah. So you might want to go back to Singapore. So I said, chalo, kuch hoga. At about 2:00, I realized it's going to be a big mess. Lockdowns and flights being cancelled and stuff. So in the 1 hour before I met you, I was actually scampering to somehow get a ticket either on Air India or Singapore Airlines or whatever it is. Finally ended up getting one in Vistara. And what was interesting was I had met you after about 2 or 3 hours of absolute stress. I mean, my cortisol levels were peaking at a crazy high and whatever. But yeah, it was glad. I was glad we got to meet, and I got to to try out your coffee, and it was so. Normally, people's adrenaline pumps up over coffee, but yours actually relaxed me. And interestingly, I left India at the 11:55 p.m. flight that day. Next day, Modi, Prime Minister Modi goes on stage and announces the whole lockdown and all of that. And look at where we are. So yeah, you're the last person I met in my last trip to India. So yeah, that.
And then since then you've been under lockdown, right? And Singapore is like locked that place like God knows what.
You have to appreciate Singapore for their ability to action any plan or policy that they come up with. There's a lot of people that kind of don't like the Singapore way, but it is, we all know that the trick is in implementation, right? You have great laws, great policies, educated bureaucrats, whatever it is. But just the focus on delivering for your citizens is something that, that is noteworthy from Singapore. I mean, thankfully, me, my family, we're locked in the safest place we can be at this time. And that's just so reassuring. It's not even funny. I mean, I have friends back in India. Just the number of distress calls that I get, ki oxygen chahiye, bed chahiye, remdesivir chahiye, Famiflu chahiye. Those are problems we don't have to deal with here. So yeah, so hats off to this country, man.
No, and on the hindsight, we all appreciate, right? Because there was a time when we all in India were complacent, and it was almost like the virus had gone away. I remember that I was in the US in March. Over there, like I was saying, our Indians are having immune system, and we were,
Yeah, the
like
BCG
everybody,
vaccine and all of that
yeah,
stuff. Yeah, yeah.
all kinds of theories that why our immune system is better, and I would say that we were all complacent. But at the same time, I think there is a big backlash on the government here, because while we were all bragging because of what we were, the reality was the government had the scientists, they had the data, they had the world community. I mean, look at Singapore. I mean, it has locked itself up. I mean, it could have opened up very, very easily with the number of cases. So given, you being such a big, you talk a lot about government and policy, I want to start this episode with your view on what is happening right now.
You see, I mean, first of all, it's extremely unfortunate what is happening right now. It is very tough to have a sane conversation when people have personal stories of losses, of distress, of death, and things like that. And obviously, nothing takes that away. No amount of explanation, no amount of communication takes that away. But I'd like to reframe it with a little bit of a different lens here, Vishal. Two things. One is, for those of you, I'm a big fan of the whole idea of the Velaripilis circle, right? Now, the Velaripilis circle covers, southern China, Southeast Asia, India, South Asia, blah, blah, blah. You have 50% of the world living on 9% of the landmass. Now, think about what kind of a load we are talking about here. Half the world's population lives in less than 10% of Earth. Now, when you have that kind of a pressure, all systems would crumble, boss, right? I mean, look, I don't mean to be racist against my own race, but go to Thailand, go to Indonesia, go to Malaysia, go to India. Schools don't work, hospitals don't work, transportation doesn't work, etc., etc., as well as they could in a prosperous country which does not have to deal with this kind of a load or this kind of a density of population. Look, nobody is denying that there has been a failure of the machinery, but let's recognize that it is a much bigger challenge to deal with, right? I mean, an Indore any day will be cleaner than a Bombay just because of the density of population at Bombay. I mean, there are just so many more people throwing, bags of chips and cigarette butts on the road, right? So that's one.
No, but just to give you a counterpoint there, right? I mean, last year, I think every Indian citizen followed the lockdown. We all followed whatever the government said in the first wave. While there were people who were, here and there doing and breaking things, but let's say that majority of India followed the lockdown and followed every instruction given by the government as much as possible. And we had this huge exodus of migrants. I mean, this year, I think the part of the challenge is that there was no warning. There was no, right now, the reality is that we don't feel like there is a government. I mean, you are sitting in Singapore and helping people. I am sitting in Mumbai and helping people. I have friends who are volunteering for everything else. So everybody except the government seems to be working right now. That's the problem.
Which brings me to the second point I was going to make, right? And I love these kind of conversations because we are challenging each other and both of us are open to being proven wrong. You see, this is my read, and I'm no expert. There is COVID fatigue, which is a reality. I mean, people have been locked into their houses. People have, middle and lower middle class people, especially manual labor, their cash inflows have dried up and, those kind of things are happening. So let's deal with it apolitically, right? At this point of time, everybody is extremely stressed out. Cortisol levels are soaring. Autoimmune levels within their bodies are extremely low. When you face this kind of a situation physiologically, you want or you tend to externalize the blame on somebody. And logically and rightly so, it has to be the government. Why? Because it cannot be anybody else. So on one hand, I'm empathetic to people who are just so fatigued by this whole situation that now they've said, ki nahi yaar, nikalna hi hai. In a lot of cases, they don't have an option. I mean, imagine you're a plumber, you're a mason, you're a carpenter. How long can you last without, being out there, without going back to work and whatever work you could find? On the other hand, it is very natural. And if you talk to a psychologist, they'll tell you that it is very natural when we are not able to explain our current situation or distress. We want to point a finger at somebody and say, hey, listen, I am in this situation because of you. The most logical you today is a government. It could be a municipality or a state government or a
No,
central
but
government.
I think there's slight difference here, right? I mean, our government had declared victory. You know, it was not a scenario where we've all seen enough in.
Oh yeah, don't get me started on that, boss. I
Yeah.
mean,
So
the
I think
communication sucks so
so I
bad.
think the challenge over here, and again, I've been a big fan of Modi ji myself. It's not that, but I think in this particular case, it is the classic case that we declared victory, before reaching the finishing line, and the finishing line, unfortunately, for this virus is vaccination of your entire population. I think,
Absolutely.
or at least majority of your, or 90% or 80% of your population. So I think while US has just announced, some relaxation, but that's when they vaccinated 50% of their population. Same thing has happened with Israel. So if we would have just held on to our horses for a few more months or a few more quarters, things would have been different. But like it is said, right, this is what uncertainty brings up. And, I think this is, we are in a perfect storm as a country. And
Yep.
I know people outside India are feeling even more helpless because, everybody has, family, parents, extended families here. And I can imagine the anguish they are all dealing with. So it is a difficult scenario. And clearly, right, I mean, whether you blame the government or you blame yourself, I think this situation could have been avoided to a large extent, which is what is kind of creating the some kind of the dissent, right? I mean, if we could, I mean, there is always cyclones, and people give you warnings, and you duck the
Yep.
cyclone.
Yep. No, but by the way, look, I have to absolutely agree with you on this. When it comes to anticipating surges, when it comes to to essentially stress planning. When I say stress planning, what kind of a stress the system would be under. When it comes to communication, it has been so terrible, it is not even funny. I mean, beyond a point, JPEGs about what have been achieved are pointless, right? At some point of time, you've got to say, at some point of time, you just have to be factual, you have to be sympathetic, you just have to be responsive, and that's about it. I mean, this was no time to gloat. People went ahead and gloated, which was dumb. But again, that's India for you, boss. There's just so many flavors and all of that. But interestingly, I'll tell you what actually makes me optimistic. And in the early 1960s, there was this researcher in Germany, Dr. Brais, Braess. He came out with this principle called the Brais paradox. Now, what the Brais paradox says is, if there are 2 points, A and B, currently, let's say there are 2 roads or 3 roads connecting A to B. He said that if there could be many situations where if you add an extra road, it will actually slow down the traffic, which is very counterintuitional if you think about it, right? That, from a supply chain, PERT, CPM, or just a very simple intuitional perspective. There are 2 roads connecting A to B. If you add a 3rd road, it actually slows traffic down overall. And this came to be known as the Brais paradox today, right? And that is something which we see coming true in India today in the pandemic, where the lack of that capacity, the lack of the 3rd or 4th road is ensuring that, and again, I'm not saying it is admirable. I mean, it is admirable, but it is not, it's not preferred or optimal that people are filling in for that lack of extra road, which to me is a huge signal of who we are as a society. The whole point of individualistic versus collective. My timeline is filled with people offering help and taking help. And of course, the government messed up. I mean, there's no denying that. But I think we found the hidden cohesion for each other at a very large collective level. So, I mean, that's something that, in these bleak times, you need something to be optimistic about here. And that's what I'm optimistic about.
No, and I think this show is also about spreading optimism and spreading hope, and which is why I wanted to bring you on, because your story is also full of hope, admiration, and what all you have done. And of course, now that we have this famous new strain of coronavirus also coming out of Visakhapatnam, I was told, which is your hometown.
Yep.
And you grew up in this coastal city and your dad was in the iron industry, right? Iron and steel.
That's correct.
So,
Yes.
yeah. So how was it like growing there? I remember I've been to Vishakhapatnam. Actually, I have a very interesting memory. I was there when the famous tsunami hit. And I was in Vishakhapatnam at that point of time, right on the beach. Can you believe that?
Uh-huh.
And the reason I love Vishakhapatnam is because that was the only place which did not get impacted because of the tsunami, because of this dolphins. There is something called the
Dolphin's nose.
dolphin's nose. So
Yeah.
we were literally saved by the dolphin's nose in Vishakhapatnam. Of course, then we were stuck there for several days before we got a flight out. But I have some of the best memories in Vishakhapatnam. So tell us about your Vishakhapatnam, please.
So look here, there are three things about Vishakhapatnam which will be very difficult to explain to a Bombayite. Okay, let me first talk about why. Because Bombayites are stuck in a bit of a Stockholm syndrome, right? You guys grow up in a city which is crowded, which is, where there's no space to play, and where you travel for 4.5 hours to work, and you think that that's somehow amazing. Vizag, Vishakhapatnam, or Vizag as we call it, is literally the opposite of that. Vizag, I mean, it has been blessed by the gods, just historically speaking. Just because of the way the city is structured, it's, we're on the Bay of Bengal, and then there's a bay beyond that. Vizag has a natural port, which makes it very attractive, blah, blah, blah. But more importantly, as a child, it had all the advantages of a metro without all the mess of a metro, right? So on one hand, we had great schools, wonderful restaurants, great places to hang around, etc., etc. But at the same time, believe me, boss, I mean, my best friends today are from there simply because the spatial features of the city were structured to build deep relationships with people, right? Lots of things to do, spaces to hang around, etc., etc., etc. I'm genuinely quite blessed that I had the parents that I did. They actually focused on the right set of values. 50% of what I learned is from my parents. The other 50% is from Govinda movies, right? So my
Govinda movies, yeah. You are here. We have a Govinda fan.
Yeah, absolutely, man. Woot woot for Govinda. But yeah, I think as I tell my wife, if my parents weren't in Vizag, we would have gone there for a honeymoon. It's a lovely place. It's a small place. You get from anywhere to anywhere in 10 minutes, 15 minutes tops. Yeah, absolutely great memories of that place. Absolutely great memories of the place. And on a per capita basis, some amazingly great people have come out of Vizag. So I don't know. I mean, maybe it has to do with the Vastu of the place or something. But yeah.
I can personally vouch for it being blessed by the gods. I was there when we needed God the most, and Vishakhapatnam is clearly. And I think I think it's one of those underrated places. It doesn't turn out to be in people's itinerary when they visit India. A lot of people end up going to Hyderabad or some other places, but I think it has to be an absolutely must-visit place. So tell me, you ended up literally studying, doing your college and school from Vizag and becoming a chartered accountant. Now that's for a middle class family, that's like the ultimate, right? CA is like 1% or whatever, 0.5% pass percentage, and you had made it in life.
Yeah, okay, that's the story I would like to tell myself. The real story was, there are a few people who have absolute clarity what they're not worth, right? I was very clear I would not make it into, IIT or AIIMS or whatever it is. अपने को बचपन से quadratic equations नहीं समझ में आते थे. So I was one of the few people that out of choice did not take, physics and chemistry and biology and whatever in my 11th and 12th. I think I was absolutely clear that chartered accountancy was something I wanted to do.
You wanted to do chartered accountancy. What was this love? I mean, it's not something which you want to do, right?
No. I mean, in hindsight, you recognize that bean counters are boring. But, see, one of the things which I'll always thank my father for, after I finished my 10th standard board exams, you have that 3 month of a vacation, right? He booked me train tickets to visit all my uncles and aunts. And if you remember back then, you had this thing called a cyclostyle machine. Does that ring a bell?
या जो हाथ घुमाना पड़ता था उसको.
घुमाना पड़ता था, हाँ. So he typed out a list of questions, made copies in a cyclostyle machine and gave it to me. And it was essentially a survey. You see, today you have the internet and you have Pearson's and then you have WhatsApp and all of that. We're talking of the early 90s. And he said, look, I want you to go down to each uncle or aunt that is in a different profession. Somebody's a teacher, somebody's a doctor, somebody's an engineer, blah, blah, blah. Sit down with them and understand what their life is like. What drives them, what motivates them, how busy are they, how happy are they, things like that. And then you take your own call. And I think that's the most productive 1 month I have spent ever. Because my awareness quotient or learning quotient went from literally zero. I mean, Vizag isn't really, you don't really have very many kind of experts or professionals there. So just interacting with 20, 30 people of different professions, then taking, being very intentional about what I was not interested in or not capable for. You see, for me, intentionality is a very big thing here, generally speaking, right? Most of us, most Indians, our generation, aren't intentional about anything, about their education, about their career, about their marriages, about parenting, about what they eat, when they sleep, when they get up. It's, we're all on autopilot mode. So I think, that process just helped me become very intentional about what is it that I really wanted to do. And then again, I messed up. Right. When I say I messed
do
up.
you remember some of those questions, what you were asking? It's quite amazing. I've never heard of, a kid going around asking questions to people. And this is, you were talking about the late 80s, I presume, or early 90s. When
early
was
90s.
This?
By the way, at some point, you should meet my father. Seriously path-breaking for his time. Huh? The 2-3 things. One is, right from when we were children, he said, dude, make your own decisions. Whatever be the consequences, learn how to own consequences for your decisions. Even if it is something simple, ki kaun si movie dekhna hai, blah, blah, blah. Second, which was very progressive for his time. So my mother was a homemaker, very traditional family. But my dad would say कि Sunday को तुम्हारा school नहीं है, मेरा office नहीं है, तो अम्मा रसोई में नहीं घुसेंगी, right? So, Sunday, my brother and me and my dad would do the cooking. So, my dad, I think, was really ahead of his time in many, many ways, despite coming from a very small village called Sivni, which you can't even find on a map now, which he's very proud of, but that's another story. So yeah, I mean, some of those questions, very basic questions, कि आप office कब जाते हैं, office से वापस कब आते हैं, right? कितने सैटरडे संडे आपको काम करना पड़ता है, राइट? कि आप अपने काम में गणित ज्यादा यूज करते हैं, हाथ ज्यादा यूज करते हैं, दिमाग ज्यादा यूज करते हैं, बेसिक क्वेश्चंस लाइक दैट, just to kind of suss out what it looks, how predictable is your day? I mean, how many times do you get called? What, blah, blah, blah. There were questions around what kind of salaries do you get? Things like that. And we had no idea back then because there was no information available, right?
So you ended up, eventually going to the US,
Yep.
So was there a gap between, because, once you do chartered accountancy here, you are like arrived in life in India, right? You could have got a great job here and there was absolutely no reason for you to go abroad. What pushed you to do that?
Yeah, I'll be very honest. And this is nothing against the CA Institute or people who like that profession. I think at some point when you start understanding what you're about from the inside, you start recognizing that, or at least I started recognizing that, hey, chartered accountancy is great. It is aspirational and all of that. There's a lot of validation that I'm receiving. Ki, Achha, first attempt mein pass ho gaye, rank mil gaya, all of that. But from a long-term perspective, is this something that I see myself doing? And is this something I like? So like you dropped out as well, didn't you? From college, right?
Of course, I did.
So in a way, you could say that I dropped out just a little later, in the sense, I decided I don't want to be a CA 10 years down the line. But it was like 3 months before the final exam. So I said, chalo, exam likh dete hain, right? After that, the whole idea, and again, mind you, my foundation was in Vizag in the 70s and 80s, right? So very limited perspective. While I was doing my CA, I figured out that career options, like I know I'll sound stupid now, but when I was a child, I didn't know there was something called an MBA, right? It was only much later, right?
MBAs only became popular in the 2000, not even 1990s. I would say 2000 onwards.
Yeah, absolutely. So while I was doing my CA, I said, look, am I just counting what a businessman does or counting what a company does, or am I playing a broader role within the enterprise, which involves strategy, which involves marketing, which involves finance, etc., etc. So at some point I said, look, a natural progression is to do my CA, which was amazing for me because for no other reason, but I met the first mentor in life, Dr. Connie Constance, who I'm never going to forget. The biggest value of going abroad for my MBA was meeting Dr. Constance.
And which school did you end up going?
I went to the University of Texas. So I went to whichever...
UT. So UT, you went to UT.
So whichever public school gave me a scholarship, I said, chalo, yahi pe chalte hain, because that's all you can afford.
And which city were you in?
In Dallas. I was in Dallas. This was ages back.
In cowboy country, huh? Literally cowboy country.
Total cowboy country, loving it. Cheap Mexican food, lots of space, low rentals. You see, all the reasons why people are moving from the Silicon Valley to Austin and to Miami now. All those reasons and more held true back then.
Yep.
Right. Yeah. With the lowest salary ever I was living in the biggest house I've ever had.
I can imagine, right? And that too, from somebody from India, it can be quite overwhelming, right? I mean, this whole US culture of, I remember going there and looking at the size of a pizza slice.
Yep.
I think when you go to New York and you order that $1 slice, the slice is as big as a pizza you would get here. The one slice.
Absolutely.
And that's America, right? For us, everything is super large.
And Texas, everything is big in Texas, as they say.
Yeah. Texas is even larger.
Absolutely.
Texas is larger. So, you were super successful. You went to the US and then you returned back to India, or from there you booted out somewhere else. I mean, what happened?
So it's very interesting, so I moved to Singapore in 2007 or so. In the 13 years before that, I lived in 9 different cities in 3 different continents, right?
Wow. 13 years, 9 cities. That's almost a city every year.
Almost. And that was absolutely by choice because every time there was an opportunity to, for a transfer, to move or whatever, I'd go raise my hand, right? I mean, I think one of the after effects of growing up in Vizag is that you really, really want to see the world, right? So, I was in the US and then, Germany for some time, UK for some time, then posted back to India for some time and then finally Singapore. I think the idea at that time was to also just understand how people live, what motivates them, you need to, for anything, just say what, the soap you bathe with, the food you eat, right? The how you run, how you exercise, how you sleep. It's kind of important to know what 10 different variants of that particular activity are so that you can be your best self. In fact, one of the things I love doing even now, whenever we vacation, is I really love hanging out at large grocery stores. Just in India, you have Big Bazaar and all of that. Just to go there, walk the shelves, just to learn and fathom and understand what matters to people here. And why does that not matter to me? So I think it was curiosity, which more than anything else, which drove me all over the place.
Wow. So your hobby is to visit shopping or grocery stores. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, not shoes, not clothes, not watches or any of that stuff. But yeah, I mean, what drinks do you drink?
So no wonder it got you back to the biggest shopping mall in the world, which also is a country, Singapore.
Absolutely. No, and we're loving it here. We're loving it here for that. It's the world in a country. You could hang out with a Brazilian and an Australian and a Ghanaian, eating Turkish pide and drinking. I don't know,
French wine,
a German drink and the multiculturality here is crazy amazing, and for very selfish reasons, right? Because it helps you explore deltas in every choice that you're making, right? The future self conversation is much easier if you have options on what future alternatives could look like.
Yeah. But in the last 20 years, you have worked in banking, you have led change programs, you have, been in startups, you have mentored.
Mhm.
What were some of the roles you played which had a big impact on your life?
Look, interesting questions. And I think there's a recency effect to this. The corporate roles, I think everybody does it. And I'm talking of most people. I mean, people who are not able to find their passion, let's say. Everyone does it out of a sense of duty, right? Duty towards yourself, your family, filial piety towards parents, etc., etc. The two things that have excited me the most is the India Pride project, which you talked about, where the whole funda here is simple. I mean, as India
No,
grows
but
as
but
a
but, but
nation.
India Pride came much later, right? And we will talk about India. I just want to understand that for somebody who is young, who has got this opportunity to go abroad, what really excited you and what really kept you going? Because of course you had to also make a living and establish yourself.
Uh-huh.
What kind of out of all the roles you played, I mean, why would you not just continue working for the bank? What quitting a bank and taking doing a startup itself was a big risk, I presume, for you.
Yeah. So here's the answer. I think I didn't realize it back in the past. Now I understand where that comes from. I would like to think of myself as somebody that would get bored relatively quickly. And when I say bored relatively quickly, once you've learned something, you've learned how to deliver on it, etc., where's your evolution coming from, right? Much later, I learned why that was, and the whole idea of neuroplasticity. I'm a major Andrew Huberman fan, which is how does your brain grow or evolve based on external stimulus. So I guess what I was looking for throughout was new forms of stimulus, because that meant new form of learning, new form of self-awareness, etc., etc. And I would think the opportunity to pick up new skills, new stuff, new challenges would have been the strongest in my mind. And I think that's the primary motivation. And of course, you make it sound sensible, saying, "Acha, let's go to a new city. There's new stuff to do there. There's new people to meet. There's new things to try out, etc., etc." So I think the search for newness, not just how it works on you emotionally, but how it works on you psychologically. I think
No,
that's
and I think what you just talked about neuroplasticity, right? I mean, for people, it's not a very easy concept to understand, but the simple thing is that you should do things out of your comfort zone, and that's when
precisely.
your brain develops. So if
Yep,
you are not good in singing, you should
yep.
sing, because suddenly your brain will have to start developing those neurons. Or if you think you are not good in painting, or you are not good in which is why learning a new language is actually one of the best ways to stimulate your brain. So there are a lot of such activities. And what you did was you literally made this your life's motto and said, I'm going to do new things every time. And you did not one or two, but 13 or 9 things in 13 years.
Well, yeah, and now that I have children and all of that, you can't continue that kind of nomadic life. But now you try and find other things to try that make you hugely uncomfortable. I mean, seriously uncomfortable. And I'm fascinated because, okay, if you go back, for the longest time, we did not understand how the mind worked, right? There was no difference between brain science and mind science.
I mean,
Now,
I think traditional Ayurveda and all those guys understood it. I think the science, the traditional science, could not understand it. I think wisdom and
absolutely,
it was all
absolutely.
there. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine, interestingly in Bombay, and he came up with something very interesting, right? He says, "Ki, look, Anurag, so this was late into the evening." He says, "What's the difference between Vidya and Avidya?" Right? I'm like, "Yaar, tum hi bata do agar sawal pooch rahe ho." And he says, "Look, every book you read, every YouTube video you watch, whatever it is the view of an observer of a particular event or phenomena or whatever it is, right? So if Vishal Gondal writes a book even about Goki or India Game, whatever it is, right? It is his view about something, right? The minute somebody's view comes in, there are perception biases, there are cognitive biases, there are confirmation biases. Therefore, it is avidya, right? Now, if everything that somebody is telling you or somebody is writing or whatever is avidya, then what is vidya, right? Vidya is only what you observe about yourself, right? Because whatever is outside, again, you could look at a wall and you could say that, hey, it's orange. I could say no, it's red, right? So we get into the ideas of Maya and Mithya and the Matrix and all of that. But the idea that true Vidya is only what you discover about yourself and how you operate. The latest in mind sciences, when you study neural networks and how they operate and all of that, the latest science actually suggests that your body is actually just a vehicle for your mind, essentially, right? Your mind, for example, they're saying now has the capability for cell regeneration. Right, now think about what that means. I mean, if you could actually unlock that, I mean, you could lose the wrinkles on your face. I mean, seriously.
Well, as we jokingly say, right, Krishna said that the world is Maya, and Elon Musk just said we live in a video game, and now everybody believes Elon Musk.
Yeah, absolutely. Everybody believes Elon Musk. Yeah.
So, while this whole aspect of we living in this virtual world has been etched in all our scriptures forever. Anyway, before we go to scriptures, you went on and finally you landed up in Singapore, and Singapore is this little fishing village, of course, which is now one of the most prosperous regions in the world. And not only that, you continue to hold an Indian passport. I mean, you could have taken citizenship of any part of the world.
Yep.
So what made you, choose Singapore as your destination, and what made you be still holding on to an Indian passport?
You see, the first answer is external, avidya. The second answer is internal, vidya, right? Now, Singapore, you see, we were at a situation back in India where we saw a natural ceiling that we would have hit within a corporate career, right? Now, I would reframe that opinion today and say, I could be wrong. I could have been wrong. So the idea was, look, why not be in a bit of a regional role? Why not be in a nation that offers a little more, etc., etc. And Singapore is a very natural choice, especially if you're bringing up a family, right? It's a very safe place. The schools are great. There's no bullying. The library network is amazing. You have access to all kinds of, to anything that you need, really. So Singapore was more, I would say, a tactical decision, right? To access opportunities for ourselves and families that we might not have been able to in India. It was a fairly selfish decision. There's no two ways about it. Now, why do I hold on to an Indian passport? Because it's a part of my identity, man. I mean, it is who I am, right? I understand that there are people who'd like, again, for practical reasons, give up on the Indian passport. But that's a dealing that I'm not very comfortable doing as yet. So I don't know if I would feel very comfortable giving up a part of what I consider to be intrinsically my identity. And clearly, India has a large part in where you are today, where I am today. There's no way to deny or ignore that.
So what, in your opinion, should one look for when they are looking at any place outside India? Because right now, there is this big, there is a big theme around Indian students going abroad for studies. And, I don't know, but there's already talks about a huge immigration wave out of India. I think, there is talks that this COVID pandemic is going to lead to a lot of immigration. And clearly so, right? People who are taxpayers in India and who have, comparatively a lot of wealth today, where, literally begging for oxygen, which is worth a few rupees a liter. So what is your advice to people now who are looking at things outside India? Being that you've been everywhere, right? And what would you tell them?
Well, a couple of things, Vishal. One is, it is absolutely understandable. I absolutely empathize why you would want to look out of India. It is a natural phenomena. Like molecules would escape a high pressure zone to a low pressure zone. it's very natural for that to happen when people want to move out of a Philippines or Indonesia or India, right? It's a natural phenomenon.
But you are one of those molecules who's already outside, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And you see, I love the whole idea of Janmabhoomi and Karmabhoomi being very, very different, right? And there are alpha errors, beta errors on both, right? So, a large part of the karma that I do is still for India while I live outside India. India Pride project that we spoke about, Data Reveals, the one that I run with Mohan. All of these are primarily India focused, and I could not have done these if I wasn't living in Singapore. But that's besides the point. I understand people want to move out from a high distress environment to a low distress environment. It is a very individual choice. There are many factors around, what tax rates look like, what lifestyle choices are offered, proximity to India or to back home, if you have friends and family living there or not. Based on the stage of life, do schools matter to you more than pubs and bars do? Or is it the other way around? Are you an urban guy? Are you, do you actually like being in the lap of nature? So there's very, very many factors. So I would just say that I would think the first step of moving out is the journey of self-awareness and self-discovery to figure out here, what is it that I really desire? What is it that I really want? Once you've answered that question, it becomes a little easier to answer the next question.
And I think that's part of the problem, right? Most people don't really know what they want. Yep. And, when they are making these decisions, they are not really governed by any logic per se.
Yep.
But, clearly, and like you said, this might just be a temporary phenomenon. It will get okay in a few months or years. But from a long-term perspective, what do you see people's perception of India? We were talking of being a soft power, and, there was this whole perception being built. And of course, PM Modi was doing the right thing with his vaccine Maitri program, etc. What damage do you think India's image has taken with whatever has happened here? And do you think the world is going to forgive India and move on, or this will be a problem for some time?
You see, so look, at this stage, we know that India is terrible with managing the narrative, especially outside of India. If you look at it from a geopolitical perspective, there are nations. Take China as an example, right? Nobody's even talking about the fact that this whole virus might have come from there, right? And that chapter is closed.
Might?
Well, I'm just being politically correct here, right? So India is terrible with managing the narrative. That process has started only very recently, right? I was talking to a friend of mine in San Jose. She's the head of product for one of these fintech companies. And she was giving me all this gyan on, how she's turned vegan and how she meditates using Muse and how, she does deep belly breathing, diaphragmatic breathing and all of that. And how she does yoga twice a day, and she's taught her dog to do yoga, and apparently it's called doga or something like that, right? And at some point I told her, and she's American born and brought up. So at some point I told her, boss, do you realize you're turning Indian, right? Do you realize what's happening here? I think, I think at some point India will have no option but to invest in pushing the narrative about what the Indian way of life means at an individual level, at a self-discovery, self-improvement level. Now, at the same time, we will have to deal with the bad optics of just having the kind of population and the mismanagement and the politics and all that we do. That is a national reality. You cannot wish it away. Just today, I was looking at WHO data, right? If you look at WHO data in terms of the rate of recoveries, the pandemic, India is far higher than a lot of other countries that are bad-mouthing us today. If you were to look at per capita deaths because of COVID, right? The US is far higher than us. But guess what? Photos of our crematoriums are being published in American newspapers. Photos of their mass burials are not being published in Indian newspapers, right? So we are in a perception is reality, right? So media is creating its own Maya Jal, right? And India doesn't know how to navigate that yet. So, but yeah, the reality is Indians are suffering. The world believes somehow that India is more guilty than the other. We don't get the kind of credit for making vaccines for the world as we should have. We will get beaten there, and that's essentially what it is, right?
And talking about Maya Jal, I remember one of your friends is Rajiv Malhotra, the guy who wrote Indra's Nest, and and he talks a lot about Indian perception and what is happening. And I want to tie this back to your India Pride project, right? So India has given the world yoga and meditation and pranayam and mathematics, and we know India was the richest country, and the Britishers and all our colonization folks came and took everything away. So what is your thought? So while you are currently, and we'd love to hear more about your whole campaign to bring back some of the jewels of India and the various artifacts which were taken away from India. But what about the knowledge taken out from India, which has now been imported back to India in terms of turmeric latte and intermittent fasting and all these fancy words which have been followed in India for millions of years?
You know what? I was seeing a very nice video of this gentleman called Dr. Berg. Very interesting YouTube channel. I strongly, at the age
I follow Dr. Berg.
Follow Dr. Berg, right? So he was talking about two videos on how do you build your lung capacity back after COVID, and how do you deal with stress, which may or may not come due to illness, but otherwise, right? And one of the things he says is, what was that called? IGF, insulin generating factor, or some funda like that.
Yeah.
And he says, the only way for your IGF factor to go up, and what this does is it kind of re-sparks your parasympathetic nervous system and kills the cells that are essentially weak or whatever, and replaces them with fresh cells. And the way to do it is that you fast for 12 or 16 hours a day or whatever. And every 2 to 3 weeks, you fast, you take a whole day fast, right? And I'm like thinking, shit, man, I hope my mom doesn't see this video, because she's been trying to get me to do it for ages now.
Exactly,
right? But I think, coming back to the whole thing, right? So 2 ideas here, boss. One is, look, if you have $1, I have $1. If I give you my $1, you give me your $1, then we still have $1 each, right? If you have an idea, I have an idea, we exchange ideas, and you have 2 ideas, I have 2 ideas, right? So I think, we have to view whatever India offers, right, in that light. That, look, I'm not saying we had all the answers or we were the best, and I don't want to go down that mode. But for sure, there was a lot of useful wisdom that people are now finding the relevance for. Second, I think India historically has, in the past, right, India has been a culture where we didn't care much for intellectual property, right? So if I built or discovered something that could be put to the greater good, to the use of people at large, I would share that with people, right? Now, we didn't bother much in the past about who was using that data, how, etc., because your field of impact was geographically very limited. Those are conversations which we've now started having, because others have started misutilizing the wisdom that we've made, right? So today, somebody wants to patent, a neem and a turmeric and whatever it is. Of course, we should reject and retaliate and push back with all force. But let's understand that India was the first open source country, boss, right? And it still happens to be open source, right? You can go to the Kotakal Aryavaidishala, to where they treat illnesses that actually cannot be treated by the best of orthos, right? And they will tell you exactly what they're doing, how it's impacting your body, and how you could do it once you go back home, right? I mean, imagine how priceless that piece of information is, right? If somebody had discovered that kind of a solution in the Western medical system, they would have essentially looted you for it, right?
And we know that the Patanjali Yoga Sutra and our,
Yep.
All our ancient scriptures, all the Vedas are filled with such, such pieces of knowledge and wisdom.
Yep.
But in your case, you went after something very interesting, right? We all know that India was looted of all our treasures.
Yep.
So tell me, how did this idea come about, and how did you start India Pride Project? And please explain for everybody listening that what are you doing as part of this?
Tell me, have you seen Bahubali?
I'm sure everybody has, and I have too.
Okay, so let's go back to Bahubali 1, when the last war happens, right? Now, if you remember, you have the Kalakeyas that are attacking Mahishmati, right? There is a point in that war, and you might, for your viewers or audience right now, you might want to close your eyes and actually visualize the scene, right? There is a point where the Kalakeyas break the flanks of Mahishmati, go up the ramparts, and actually pull Mahishmati's flag down and put up their black colored Kalakeya flag up there, right? That's the point where Mahishmati falls, so to speak. And then you have these scenes of the Mahishmati army soldiers rushing back and getting whatever, stabbed and killed and stuff. Now at some point you have Kattappa, the general, who actually goes and reclaims that flagpole, because the Mahishmati flag is already gone. He pulls down the Kalakeya flag and puts up the dead body of the Kalakeya general there, right? And that's when you have the moment where the battle takes a U-turn, right? Now, if you were to think about it, why was that flag important, right? I mean, it's a 2 feet by 3 feet piece of cloth. Why does it have any more meaning, than the molecules and cells and threads and tanabana that it is made from, right? Why? Because it is symbolic, right? It is symbolic of the nation, what it stands for, of the community, of its people, etc., etc. Now, once your symbols go down, it means defeat, right? Now, how does it apply to what I do, right? Now, if you look at India, you see, as India as a nation is younger than my father, right? So India is literally a generation old, right? But we as a civilization are thousands and thousands of years old. And, so the question then becomes, what is the symbol of our civilization, right? Does my pride go back only to 1947, or does it extend beyond that, right? The Haldi Doodh and yoga and pranayama and, the Patanjali Sutra that you talked about. None of that is part of India as we know it, as we politically know it today, right? It is a part of India or Bharat, which goes back, thousands of centuries, thousands of years. What is the symbol of that? The symbol of that is the heritage that we've owned for the longest time, right? You've had Kalakeyas coming in, plundering that heritage and taking it away, right? How do you reclaim that symbol? I mean, I had a basic question, right? How do you reclaim pride unless you can reclaim symbols of that pride, right? And symbology is huge for us, right? You're wearing a t-shirt.
For example, what's happening in the US, they wanted to take down all the statues which reminded them of, the whole atrocities on blacks. So, I mean, symbolism is very, very important.
Yeah, and at an individual level, boss. At an individual level, you are wearing a Goki t-shirt, right? Why is that t-shirt important to you? Why is your logo important to you? Because it means something to you. We have pictures of our children, of our parents, of our grandparents, or whoever has passed away. Why is that important? So I think, the connection, and there's a lot of empirical research that has actually happened on this. From an anthropological studies perspective, the correlation between symbology and self-confidence at a collective level is extremely high. It is extremely, extremely high, right? Which is why football teams have their symbols, their mascots. I mean, why, Bachpan mein we had Asian Games. Why did it need an Appu? Why does the Olympic need a mascot, right? Because symbology is important. It works at a subconscious level that we ourselves don't understand actively, right? That's where India Pride Project came from. And we're saying, hey, listen, we just need to make the case for a very simple idea that history belongs to its geography. This was a line coined by a friend of mine, Ananda Shankar Jayan, who's a Padma Award winner and all, as you know. And she just came up with this, and I said, yeah, this is beautiful, right? History does belong to its geography. Heritage was made for certain people, for certain communities. By snatching it away, you're doing a huge disservice to everybody involved, right? Look, it could be a Gayang or a totem pole from Ghana, right? It could be a bronze from Benin. It could be a Murti from India. It could be whatever, right? Things deserve to be where they deserve to be. I mean, the whole life. If you watch Black Panther, sorry, just 1 second. If you watch Black Panther, right? If you remember what makes Killmonger Killmonger, right? What makes him Killmonger? If you remember the museum scene, right? He goes in there, points the object from Wakanda, and looks at the curator and says, "Hey, do you know how it got here?" And I think that story is really, really important for us to be able to show the bloody past that our communities have had to live with. It's that reconciliation is really, really important.
So just for simplifying this for everybody out here, we all know that, when Britishers and all the colonizers came here over the last few, 100, 500, 800 years, a lot of gold, a lot of statues, a lot of artifacts, a lot of, murtis, etc., were literally taken away or stolen from India and taken all over the world. In fact, museums are filled with a lot of these things. And of course, these are also part of many private collections. So what you wanted to do was go back and claim this back to India, but you want to do this legally. You're not just going and sending your private army to steal it back.
Oh, you know what? So it's a very good question. In fact, Washington Post there's an article about this, where they actually compare the China approach with the India approach. Now, what is alleged right now is that the Summer Palace in China has actually, how do I say this politically correctly? They have found ways to bring back what people are not legitimately offering back, right? So what the article alleges, or it's an op-ed, not an article, that China goes to a museum and says, "Hey, listen, this vase belonged to the Ming Dynasty. We need it back." And if the museum says no, lo and behold, within the next 3 to 6 months, there's a huge robbery in the museum where the vase gets stolen, right? That's the Chinese way. Our way...
I think now they don't even need to do that. I think they can simply say, "We are from China and you know what we just did."
Exactly, right? Our way is premised more on having the conversation around morality, on having an ideological conversation. Because I'll tell you what, right? When the British had a gun in their hand, they took away whatever they felt like. China has a gun in their hand, they'll take away whatever they feel like. 50 years from now, somebody else will have a gun. 50 years after that, somebody else will have a gun. You're essentially saying, boss, my grandfather had a spear, your grandfather had a gun, so you took away stuff from my grandfather. That cycle needs to stop. And that cycle stops only when you have the moral conversation.
And tell me something, how is this conversation happening? And I know you've had a lot of successes in recovering a lot of these items. Mm-hmm. Do you just go to a museum and say, "Sir, here is a complaint from this police station. There's an FIR that this is missing in 1855. One of the sepoys took it and now please give it back." And, is that the conversation? Or... because, I mean, if I am a museum, I'll say, "Sorry, dude, I don't know who you are. Finders, keepers. I got it and this is mine."
Yeah, but we could do a little bit of tedi ungli and shame you into it, na?
No, but I mean, these people have thick skins.
Yeah, well, a thick skin is still not impenetrable. So
tell me a couple of success stories where you were able to get stuff back.
Absolutely. So I'll tell you.
Of course, legal and in a very nice and polite way, I'm sure.
No, of course. I am very nice and polite, as you know. But on a serious note, I think there are a couple of things that are happening, right? One is the conversation does not need to happen at an individual level, right? The conversation can be around changing the narrative, at a country level, at a ministry level, So, for example, the conversation around the Parthenon marbles in the UK. That conversation has been going on since 1929, right? Now, since 1929, people have been saying that, hey, they need to go back to Greece. You've had Christopher Hitchens and Stephen Fry and George Clooney and Matt Damon putting their voice behind this idea. And above all, you've had Bill Murray put his voice on it, right? Now, the conversation went nowhere, like you said, because of the thick skin. Now, if you were to take it down to a next level and start conversations with members of parliament, which have a large voter base that comes from India or is connected to India, people of Indian origin, then it becomes a conversation which becomes actionable, right? If you start intervening a little more bluntly with the narrative, right? So, for example, I had faced a lot of backlash when I'd written an op-ed a couple of years back, which said, dear Queen, thou shalt not steal. And the whole premise of that article was that, hey, listen, you are a queen, when you got crowned by the Archbishop of Canterbury, did he have a conversation with you about the 10 commandments? One of which is thou shalt not steal. And how do you, so blah, blah, blah.
No, and of course, the elephant in the room, which every Indian talks about, is the famous Kohinoor diamond, which we know is right now with none other than the Queen herself. So बाकी सब छोड़ दो. How do we get back Kohinoor?
बाकी सब क्यों छोड़ दो boss? सब आएगा, सब वापस आएगा. Look.
I mean, I know. I'm just saying that right now. Everybody will say, first get Kohinoor, then I will give you the smaller things, right? The biggest artifact of India is right now in front of our eyes.
It's interesting you say that. It's an interesting question. Can we make the claim that that is the biggest artifact that is out there? It might be the most visible, I agree with you. It might be the most controversial, I agree with you. But there are articles, there are objects of faith that might be far more important to people. So
give some examples. Like I don't know. I have no idea. I'm sure a lot of people don't know about these artifacts.
Yeah. So look, I'll tell you. The first restitution that happened in recent history was in September 2014 from Australia. Right now, for the longest time, the research or the theoretical work or the academic work was already done. Right. So people knew what was stolen from where, which museum had it, etc., etc. What it needed was for this issue to become a media issue and be a political issue within Australia, right? Which we were kind of able to nudge, and we were kind of able to make that happen. So Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister then, when he had come to visit Prime Minister Modi, had brought these objects along and handed to Modi to PM Modi in a very visible ceremony. Couple of years back, within the UK, we had our volunteers go into the British Museum and the V&A Museum. And it was very interesting. This is why I love hanging around with younger guys, because they have ideas far better than you and I do. So all they did was they printed out speech bubbles like you have in comics now. They printed out speech bubbles, just cut around them, took them into museums, put it in front of an object and took a picture with it. That's it. Right. So let's say you have a Murti of Durga in the background. There's a speech bubble that says, help, I'm kidnapped. Right. Or another speech bubble that says, hey, my people are waiting for me back home. Or how did I get here? Stuff like that. And this was done by a bunch of, I wouldn't say kids, but very young adults in their 20s. And this became so viral in the UK that it actually became a conversation topic in the 46 parliamentary constituencies, where you have a large number of PIOs. The conversation started in the UK then, and then you've had the UK giving back a few objects, etc., etc. So I think the whole idea is, look, we worked very hard to hit our Rosa Parks moment, right? And the Rosa Parks moment is when what was considered legit 10 years back becomes illegit today, right? And I think that's the tipping point which we've now achieved, not just for India, but for a whole bunch of other countries. You have a dozen countries giving back heritage objects to former colonies. And I think 10 years from now, nobody will be able to legitimately sit down and say that, listen, I stole this from your grandfather, but it's mine today. That conversation will be very, look, the world is becoming more woke, more politically correct.
Yeah.
Right?
I think the problem somewhere is that, you call it the India Pride Project, but I don't know how many Indians forget about being proud. They are even aware of this. I think part of our whole problem is that we just don't know, we just have no idea. And same thing, I was trying to extend this to not just physical objects, but even ideas, right? Which are now being fed back to us in a Western packaging.
Mm-hmm.
And, we are trying to lap those ideas up. and pay patent fee and all that on top of it when it is coming back to us.
Yep.
So this same, you may go to one of the museums and end up buying one of these, a print or something. But so how do you think this problem can be sorted out? Because I think more than getting those objects back, you do all this fight, but people here are just don't care.
And that's fine. That's a 4SW rule, Vishal. I mean, some will, some won't. So what? Someone else will, right? And that's fine. Not every Indian needs to be interested in tracking their health for you to have started a Goki, right? You need to have a small critical mass, knowing that it is your job to change people's hearts and minds after that, and therefore behaviors. Therefore, you, for example, are on a mission to move the needle on how healthy people are in general. It doesn't matter if people get it right now or not, right? That is something that we need to effectuate. And that it will take time. It's not easy. I mean, it's a large country. It is truly a diverse country. I mean, India is like 50 different countries within a country. It doesn't matter. I mean, it has, you do stuff because it matters to you, not because it matters to anyone else.
And I think, Anurag, that's where you have hit the nail on the head, right? I think the problem with most people is that they don't do something or they stop doing something because they think, oh, what will it matter to somebody else? And I think your message over here is it should matter to you. It doesn't matter whether 2 or 5 or 500 other people even care about it. But if what matters to you is important, it will automatically get more people joining your mission. And I think that's exactly what happened with the India Pride project.
Absolutely. In fact, I think it's a bigger Indian disease of char log kya kahenge. If you are seeking validation, if you need somebody else to certify whether your time on this earth is being spent productively, then there is a lot of deep thinking that there's a conversation you need to have with yourself, right? And I was at that stage at some point in my life, right? I really worried about what would my boss say and wife say and mother say and aunt say and all that kind of stuff. It needed a lot of deep thinking. It needed a conversation. It needed self-awareness. It needed self-work to overcome that. I see a lot of Indians going through that now. It's also a factor of socioeconomic progress, individually and then us as a nation, right? I mean, for the longest time, you're on a hamster wheel, and that's fine as well. I mean, duty is a genuine limitation for people. And I see that happening. I don't hope for it anymore. More and more people recognize that, listen, I need to do something because it matters to me. I know that it is important. I don't care if others believe it is important or not. And as you said, over time, if people see you as driven by a genuine passion, that's when the magic happens. That's when intents start coming together. You live in Chembur, right? One of my nephews in your neighborhood, when the whole pandemic started and when the lockdown started, he recognized that street dogs weren't getting any food, right? So normally you would eat a bhel puri, drop it away somewhere, and the street dog would go into a dustbin and eat the food. Or, you eat half an apple, throw it away, the dog eats it. You eat a piece of tandoori chicken, throw the bone away, the dog eats it. None of that was happening because stuff was shut. So this guy, 23-year-old guy, right, with his college friend, just start collecting leftover food and leaving it out on streets so dogs could eat it. Cut to a couple of months later, you had a whole bunch of people doing it in their streets and their colonies. Magic genuinely happens at the last if the right intent gets pulled together. I mean, I'm a genuine believer in that.
No, and I think what you just said is very important, right? I think it doesn't matter what the country can do for you, but what you can do for the country or you can do for humanity, right? And that's really what it is. And I think a lot of people, we know that Kohinoor Diamond has been talked about for years, ever since I am a kid, we've heard about it, right? But you actually went and created an organization, teamed up with other people. And I know recently you had a big success. You were able to trace the whereabouts of a Nataraja deity which came from a temple from the banks of river Kaveri. So please tell us about how were you able to trace that?
Well, we have we have a team of researchers who are fascinating people. I mean, none of them, or rather most of them, aren't even academically qualified in the subject, but know far more about epistemology than any of us. The tracing is one part of it, right? I mean, there's so much work happened. I mean, there are people who focus on, let's say, Jain statues, or from Mount Abu, Rajasthan, Gujarat, that region. There are people who are focusing on Gandhara art on Mathura. There are people who are focusing on stuff that gets stolen from Tamil Nadu, like the Nataraj that you talked about. There are people who are looking at, this Himachal, where you have these small paintings from Kangra, miniatures. They get stolen, taken away, etc. And there's a lot of that research work, visual mapping that happens, of provenance mapping, etc., etc. It's really deep, diligent work that needs to happen. Takes loads of time, and and that's happened for hundreds of objects, right, over the last 50, 60 years. What I'm glad about now is that we're able to change the minds of the Indian government and governments abroad to say, look, let's take this research and convert it into results, right? Let's take work that has already happened by very capable people, and move the needle and say, okay, now let's actually bring these objects back. That's the journey that's been real fun.
And you've done some other amazing things, and I think one very important thing I want everybody to know, and by the way, one of our most popular guests on the show has been somebody who's our common friend, Tritankar Dash. So when I was in Singapore, and Anurag was introduced to me by Dash, and I told him, I have a evening which is free. Tell me who's the one person I should meet, and yours was the only name which came up. And that's really why I value our relationship so much. And I think we almost clicked the first time we met, right? Because I think there is the people who have a wavelength which matches.
Absolutely.
And I think with you, I think ever since we met, again, this is a few years now, it was almost instant connection. And I can now understand, I think, your selfless nature and your desire to give back, expecting nothing in return. I mean, none of these statues are getting you, any commercial value, or it's not like you are standing for elections and getting votes. But well, you may have to consider that, maybe given the scenario in India, anyways.
No.
So tell me something. How is it for you to be in a scenario where you have to constantly deal with bureaucrats and a lot of these politician types? How do you think a government in India can function, and what has been your experience, and what is your suggestion to the bureaucrats or the politicians on what can they do to make a better India?
Acha, Vishal, I tell you what, I get your question and why that's more important. But going back to the Dash meeting, can I actually tell you another story that you actually don't know as yet?
Oh, tell me, why not?
Okay, so interesting story. If you remember where we met at level 4 of the Mandarin, and we were sitting there, and we had this fascinating conversation, blah blah blah. If you remember, you have those red sofas on one side, and then you have the chairs and tables, and we were sitting around the sofas, right? Cut to a couple of years later after that, right? I was going there with another common friend of ours, right? Mohandas Pai, right?
Of course.
So I told Mohan ki, so we were going to sit on the chairs. I said ki nahi, wahan nahi baiठte hain. Let's sit on this. So literally on the table, table that Dash and you and I sat. 2 years later, Mohan and I sat literally on the same table, the same sofa, and we conceptualized data reveals, right? Which is now, of course, whatever it is. So it's fascinating. I mean, maybe there's a vastu of that sofa, or maybe it is just your kind of whatever aura or something that is left, that was left in that space.
So one thing we are sure that next time, whenever Singapore lets us in, we are going to meet in that same location.
And literally, we'll sit on the same sofas. Just we won't change anything there. But look, coming back, I think politicians and bureaucrats get a bad rap all the time, right? We must not forget that in terms of per capita anything, per capita police, per capita doctors, per capita bureaucrats, per capita teachers, per capita civil servants, India is the most distressed compared to any other country, right? Therefore, it is natural that for every 100 people that knock on the door of anybody, and I'm just picking up hypothetical numbers in the air now, if 100 people knock on a door, 10 will get serviced, right? Because as a human being, you can service 10. Now, the difference in India and a low population Western countries is that there's only 12 or 15 people knocking on the door. Therefore, a larger percentage of them get serviced, right? I think what works, like with anybody else, is for you to be able to align what's in it for the person that you are meeting, right? So if you meet a politician, I think at some level, 70 years of post-oppression, as I call it, right? You see, imagine you have a boss or a spouse or a parent that is hugely abusive and oppressive, right? You will have PTSD after that, man, right? It is trauma when you get abused the way Indians did for centuries on end, right? That trauma takes time to clear exactly as you do at an individual level, you do it at a national level, at a collective level as well. India is just coming out of that trauma right now, right? It is tough to get stuff done because we're only reclaiming our identity and our understanding of how powerful we are right now. It's very easy to blame a bureaucrat. It's very easy to blame a politician or anybody else. Again, like I was saying in the beginning, because we're trying to externalize, right? You see, one of the most powerful ideas or books I've read, it's called The Question Behind the Question, right? Most people tend to ask a question, why is the Prime Minister not doing this, right? Why is my wife not cooking pakoras for me every day? Why is my boss not giving me a promotion? Why is my child not putting her phone down and playing with me? Right. Now, if you were to rephrase that question and ask the question behind the question, what can I do so my child plays with me instead of being on her phone? What can I do so my wife makes pakoras for me? What can I do so my boss gives me a promotion? What can I do so Modi prioritizes my issue? Then the conversation becomes more easier because it is something that you can control, right? I hope more and more of us start having that conversation instead of just whining about, your wife and your boss and your child and Modi and your neighbor and his dog.
And that's what brings me to your other pet project, which is Data Reveals. And I really love this quote which you have, which says numbers have life and they are not just symbols on paper, of Shakuntala Devi.
Yep.
And I think a lot of times we say things without having the underlying data, and we say it based on bias, right? I mean, when you say, "Arey, India mein sab kuch kharab hai," ya, this is bad or that is good, the underlying data under that is missing. And a lot of that, and I was reading, for example, where you talked about India has the lowest CO2 emission per capita.
Yep.
It's among the lowest in the world. And, at the same time, India has said, oh, there is so much pollution and there is so much this and there is so much that. So part of the challenge is the missing of the data and, conversation being data-led. And even right now, whatever is happening with India's bad performance on COVID, we are saying, but at the same time, there is whatever data is there is a distrust in the data.
Yep.
So when you say India is lowest, they say, "Ha, yaar," because they are only reporting 1 point. It will be 18. It'll be at least 10 times.
Yep.
So what is the idea behind Data Reveals, and how do you deal with this whole question of trust behind data?
So it's an interesting question. I think it's an interesting set of questions in there. So I'm going to take each of them sequentially. Look, so the story of Data Reveals, not Data Reveals, but the idea is like 20 years old, more than 20 years old. Back in 1998, when I had first gone to B school, I actually had a classmate that asked me if I owned a pet elephant. Okay, true story. So she actually asked me if I had a pet elephant when I went to school, and did you guys?
And where did you keep your snake?
Exactly, so stuff like that. And they had formed their impression watching Indiana Jones, where people are eating monkey brains out of the skull of a monkey and stuff like that. Very often we forget we have access to how the US lives, right? You watch American television, you watch Hollywood movies, etc., etc. The West does not have access to how you live or how Indians live, right? So the idea was kind of born out of there. I pulled this girl's leg for the first 6 months, telling them how I had an elephant. It was called Appu, and then it died, and I cried for 3 days. And so I'd given all these bullshit stories, which he bought. Now, coming back to like the CO2 data you talked about, right? You watch Slumdog Millionaire, right? Or you watch Salam Bombay, right? These are images that create,
or now White Tiger now,
or White Tiger, right? So these are images that create India's perception outside, right? You see, no, and I'm going to use very strong words here. No American reporter has monetized somebody's death through the pandemic. You have Indian reporters that are monetizing death, right? Think about what that means at a moral level, right? You can go on Getty Images, pay thousands of rupees today, and buy pictures of dead bodies and crematoriums that have been taken without the permission of the families of people that have died, right? Think about the breach that represents and what our people are capable of doing, right? Now, however, so there's this whole funda that India is a filthy place. Kids keep getting kidnapped in India. There's no food to eat, and people are dying because of this, that, and the other, blah, blah, blah. Then you look at per capita carbon emissions. Then you look at per capita sexual offenses. Then you look at per capita anything. The number could be, or the reality could be hugely different. And that's the idea of data reveals, right? Where you show reality not based on fiction, which is books or movies, not based on opinion, which is, what our people write in the Washington Post and New York Times and whatever it is, but just put fact out there, just put data out there. If India looks good, it looks good. If India looks bad, it looks bad. But let people at least bank, or let people create their view based on reality and not opinion pieces, not pieces of fiction. And again, this goes back to our conversation at the seat where Mohandas and I actually conceptualized this. We can see its positive impact now because people are actually so when we talk in our platforms, you have, Smriti Irani talking about data of the Women's and Child Development Ministry and busting a lot of myths that are created outside India on, let's say, women participation in politics, right? India has a huge story there. Nobody seems to talk about it. Now, coming to the question on how trustworthy or not trustworthy data is. I mean, look, you cannot challenge somebody if they're having an emotional conversation with you. I mean, that's the reality, right? It's like the fight a husband has with his wife, or a brother has with his sister. We know that there is underreporting in India of pretty much everything. Now, my question is, what makes you think that underreporting does not happen elsewhere, right? UK, for example, talks about council homes. Now, council homes are places where you have the poorest of the poorest living. This is government housing that is given pretty much for free to people who otherwise would be, let's say, distressed or homeless, right? A large segment of crimes, you know what the first two sources of crime reporting in council houses are? The first is neighbors. So neighbors call and tell, police that, hey, somebody's doing drugs here, or, somebody's beating his wife up, etc., right? The second is teachers of public schools, right? So a child, poor fellow, is sobbing in his cafeteria. The teacher goes and says, "Ki yaar, kyun ro rahe ho?" The child says, my mother keeps beating my father, or my father keeps beating my mother, or whichever way. And then the teachers are obligated to go and report it to the authorities, right? The third source is suo motu discovery by the police. So the police is patrolling and hears sounds of violence, or whatever it is. Right now, so tell me, right? You have the UK where crimes are not being reported, especially from council homes, in a far higher degree from non-reporting that happens in India. Right. But then if somebody is coming in with a bias saying that, no, I believe that non-reporting happens only in India or underreporting happens only in India, then you really can't have a conversation with him. Right. Right. And then you go out and say, okay, fine, we understand that underreporting is happening all over the place. But official data is the best we have right now. And let's look at what that says. Nobody is saying that you don't have to strengthen data. Right. All we are saying is let's at least look at data before we decide on anything. Take an example. You have RT-PCR reports, and we know there are false negatives and false positives, right? Would you stop doing a COVID test just because some of those tests are wrong? No, you won't. You would still do a COVID test, right? And that's reality.
No, so clearly, right. I mean, when it comes to India, we have, a kind of allergy against data and data sources. So in Data Reveals project, for example, we at Goki do a lot of research with health data, which we have, of course, subjected to all privacy and other policies. And we do our own health report every year. So how can we kind of contribute to this kind of analysis, or anybody who's sitting, who has access to some kind of data, how can they participate?
Oh, brilliant question. So if you go on our website, which is datareveals.org, now this is more for your audience who are individuals. I mean, if Goki and we need to work together, then of course we have a conversation.
No, and there could be companies also who may want to participate, right? Because there
Absolutely.
is so much data which all kinds of people have today.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you go onto our website, which is datareveals.org, there's actually a top level menu which says participate, which helps you get in touch with our team, which can do one of two or three things. One is, if you have an idea, we have mentors that can guide you on where to get data, how to present it, etc., etc., etc. So there's that. Second, if you have data but you don't have an audience, we will help you bring it onto our platform, giving you all the due credit, attributing the work to you, but using our, let's say, last mile to amplify the reach of whatever data, whatever your hypothesis is, whatever you're learning because of your data. Third is, if you just say, hey, listen, I'm interested in the idea that decisions should be more factual, more logical, more rational. I want to be a part of the journey. I want to volunteer my time to something like this. Then reach out to us, and we occasionally, or rather we frequently keep having programs. We tie up with universities as an example, right? We keep running these programs which are free of charge, where people come in, learn how to collect data, how to analyze data, how to present data, how to visualize data. And we give them an opportunity to publish on our platform, which helps people individually, and it helps us as a nation if we are able to bust some of the myths that are being created against us.
No, it's absolutely incredible what you're doing through the India Pride project, through Data Reveals, and all your writings. I would highly recommend people to Google Anurag and read some of his articles and stuff he's talking. But since you are a data man, I want some hard data from you. That how do you manage to be so energetic and have so many parallel projects going on while you are also taking, I know you have wonderful kids and a family. So tell us about your hacks or your way to keep engaged with all the various activities you're doing.
It's an important question. And I'll give a slightly lengthy answer on this. Not that my other responses were short, but when you're saying how do you manage your life, what do you do to hack your life? An important question to ask is, what is you? Who are you? Are you the current you? Are you the 10-year-old you? Are you the 20-year-old you? Are you the father you? Are you the activist you? Are you the whatever you? I think it's very important to get a grip on what you are right now. The couple of things.
So let me tell you that you are the only person who has so many definitions of you. Normally, when we say you, people talk about their rituals and their hacks. But yeah,
no. I get it. But all I'm saying is I think there needs to be a recognition that even the current you is 5 different yous. Right? There's the family you, there's the friend you, there's the businessman you, there's the employee you, there's the neighbor you. So there's that. Now, I'll just talk about 2 areas of hacks and then come to, a few tactical hacks that I talk about. One is, I think emotional fitness is really important if you're trying to stretch yourself a little more than what is normal, right? Which means you need to have conversations with yourselves. You need to have conversations with people that help you grow intellectually. You need to be a little more self-aware than average. Deep rationalizing is something that has helped me quite a bit, amazingly well. I mean, just to not get pissed with how people react to you, but to understand rationally where they're coming from and why they are who they are. Right? The ability to genuinely say it is what it is very, very important. the future self conversation I have with myself or with others is very important. In terms of physical fitness, I think 2 or 3 simple hacks, right? A couple of them are from our friend Ravi Mantha, right? He's gotten me.
Yeah, he's another character we have to bring on the show.
Oh, you must. It'll end up being a 6-hour show, but you must,
And in that 6 hours, he may end up giving me some massage and some therapy.
Don't kid yourself. I know you like it. But back in 2011-12, when he would talk to us about the importance of bacteria in hacking our physical health, I would never pay attention to it. Till it came on the cover of Time.
We can have another episode talking about Mantha, but my favorite quote from him is that he insisted that we should get fecal transplants done.
Well, I'm not going to get into that. But whatever. So he's got me onto probiotics, and that has changed quite a bit. Changed me, how I operate, how my body operates as a machine. The other tip is I donate blood very often, right?
Yeah.
All the toxicity that keeps building up within ourselves from the air we breathe, from the food we eat, very often from look, if your adrenal glands are not working well, you have stuff that is piling up, and none of our, believe me, get it tested, none of our adrenal glands are working well today. I mean, we are living very unnatural lives. We sit for longer, we think more than we should, blah, blah, blah. So another hack, donate blood as often as you are logically allowed to.
No, and in fact, I used to do it at least twice a year, but given this whole pandemic situation, I have not been able to do it. But hopefully once things open up, I will be back in the line for blood donation.
Yeah. But coming back, absolutely. And I would recommend everybody do it, especially if you're an above 30 male. There's no reason you should not be doing it, even if you want to do it for selfish reasons. I mean, that's my point here, right? Don't do it for charity, this and that. Do it purely because it is actually good for you. I mean, in the ancient day, you had the whole practice of bloodletting. Right? There was a reason bloodletting was popular back then. But coming back to your specific question, Vishal, a few life hacks. I'm terrible with names, right? So one life hack, I always keep saying people's name aloud when I meet them for the first time. Right? That has saved my skin more than once. Life hack 2, because I'm terrible with stuff, I take pictures of everything, right? I mean, take pictures of where you've parked your car, because, you will get lost. You won't remember whether it was left tha or right tha, 4th level tha or 5th level tha, whatever it is. So take pictures of the khamba where your car is parked. I take pictures of my luggage before it goes, before I check it in, because what if it gets lost, Instead of saying that I have a 32-inch red color suitcase and you don't remember whether it was American Tourister or Samsung or whatever, Samsonite or whatever, I take a lot of pictures. Another life hack that works exceedingly well, and I would strongly recommend, there's a very dear friend of mine, Nir Eyal. Nir Eyal has written this book called Indistractable. And it's a...
And I think he wrote Hooked also, right? Hooked is also...
So he wrote Hooked 10 years back, got people hooked onto technology. And now, so I keep teasing him that he's written an antidote to Hooked, but he's really angry when I call it that. But Indistractable is, how do you manage yourself in an era where there are so many things that are trying to distract you? Your phone is pinging all the time, and if you're working from home, your family's on your shoulder, and there's an email and a Zoom call happening at the same time, and that electricity ka bill bharna hai. How do you become indistractable is something that
and by the way, on that point of being indistractable, right? The whole idea of this podcast was exactly that. It was the antidote, right? Because people want 1 minute, 60-second content. People want the entire gyan in one tweet. And, our average episode ends up being 1.5 hours to 2 hours long. Because that's the kind of attention you need to give to good learning and knowledge. You can't expect a 128 character tweet to give you a knowledge of the conversation one can have with somebody like you.
So as my mom used to say, like I said, 50% of my gyan comes from my parents, right? My mom would always say कि घी जितना डालोगे हलवा उतना ही अच्छा बनेगा, right? If your self-learning is limited to tweets and 3-minute TikTok videos or whatever, then God help you, right? Unless you're reading, unless you're listening to deep conversations, participating in them yourself, then there's very little growth that you can hope to achieve. You'll be limited by your own capacity, I would say. Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right there.
Amazing. Also, you seem to be also making a lot of jokes around Star Wars. How did you come about that?
So actually, there's a joke behind the joke. So my kids and I engage in this thing which is...
First, tell us a Star Wars joke. Then you should say this.
By the way, absolute cringe alert. I'm warning you upfront. These are terrible jokes. I'm caveating it, and only if you give me, only if you sign off to getting...
Yeah, we have a waiver. We have a waiver. Don't worry. Everybody on this episode who has reached this far towards the end will certainly be able to take it.
Okay. So these jokes come from an 8-year-old and an 11-year-old. Okay. So please view it in that context. Han Solo went up the Eiffel Tower. You met him there. What would you call him?
Hans Eiffel? No.
Hands so high.
Hands so high. Okay, got it.
Okay. Obi-Wan Kenobi lost all his money in gambling.
Mm-hmm.
What do you call him?
Obi-Wan Kenobi? No.
Obi-Scooter Kenobi. Van बेच के scooter खरीदना पड़ा.
Oh God.
And it goes downhill from there. Darth Vader had a brother he was really closely connected to. What was his name?
He had a brother.
Yeah, who he was closely connected to. That's the clue. I feel terrible about this already.
No, I don't know which one is that.
Okay, Darth Vader's brother, he was closely connected to Masuda Vader.
Oh God.
This is terrible, right?
This is really terrible.
There's lots more where that come from. So yeah, that's become our hobby now. My son's big time into Star Wars, which I'm actually very proud of. So there's loads of this we keep doing all the time.
Yep. Well, you also do another very important thing, which I think we both share, which is meditate. Yep. What is your idea around meditation, and what has been your experience with that?
So here's the thing here. I realized at some point that we are generally being ungrateful and unappreciative of the things that matter to us the most, right? Now, what is it that matters to you the most, right? The air you breathe, right? You would not trade off your breaths for literally anything else in the world, right?
And especially now when people are grappling for oxygen, which is like,
right?
So much in abundance.
Yeah, and how often are you actually intentional and aware and thankful for the air you breathe? I mean, think about it, boss. There are 11 billion planets in the Goldilocks zone. 11 billion with a B, right? 11 billion habitable planets. Now, in those 11 billion habitable planets, Earth is one of them. On Earth, there's 7 billion people, on which you are one of them. I mean, each of us is one of them.
Right? So we are inconsequential. I mean,
we are super inconsequential. Right? I mean, Donald Trump is inconsequential, regardless of what he would think about himself. Right? Everybody is inconsequential. Now, what are the chances that we would be here today, leading what are close to, people are unhappy that people are extremely unhappy generally about the food they eat, where they work, अरे मेरे को टाई पहनना पड़ता है, अरे मेरे को वड़ा पाव खाना था but मेरे को बिरयानी मिला, people find things to be unhappy about. But think about the chances. What are the chances? Literally 1 billion in one chance that you're here, alive, breathing well, leading whatever life you are. And I think just the fact that you need to focus on the food you eat, the breaths you take, just the fact that you need to actively understand your thoughts, your beliefs, your behavior patterns as an observer, as a third person, I think is extremely, extremely important. Otherwise, we lose sight of all these things. I mean, we end up chasing all the wrong shit. So for me, meditation is very, very important just to be able to A, appreciate things that really matter, right? B, to understand what's going on inside me. Otherwise, it's very easy to be on a hamster wheel. Otherwise, you see, I do this exercise with people, Vishal. Catch people at 9 o'clock at night, right? And tell them, Kiar, tell me what you did all day, right? Most of us wake up at 6:30, 7 o'clock in the morning, right? Believe you me, if you ask people to go through what they've done in the day, they would have spent 15 hours, but would only be able to account for 5 or 6 of them. If you go down at a granular level, right? Not कि मैं 8 घंटा ऑफिस में था. Ask them actually यार ठीक है वो 8 घंटे में तुमने किया क्या? So for me, it becomes very, very interesting, to say the least, to be able to observe yourself. And that's what meditation is to me. Right? It is of very tactical, selfish advantage.
And how much do you meditate every day typically?
So what I do is I do essentially reps of meditation, and I do it thrice a day. The one I do late in the evening is the longest. I used to need guided meditation, but I don't need it much now. So the early morning and the afternoon rep for me are about very short, 10, 12, 15 minutes, as much as I can squeeze in.
Fantastic.
Late night is where it takes a little longer. And,
Yeah. So, normally I would ask this question much earlier to people, but, I want this to be my last question to you. And given that you are so data driven and, with all the logic and everything, what is your take on destiny?
It's a very important question. I do believe in the idea of randomness, and that randomness is extremely powerful, right? Now, people could call it destiny, people could call it luck, people could call it chance, naseeb, whatever it is, right? I do believe that a large part of who you are is beyond your individual control. That is something I do believe in. I do believe that deeds play a part in where you find yourself. Karma, some people call it karma, but I believe karma works because of what it does to you internally. Not because somebody is sitting down with a ledger and saying, ki, okay, Anurag nahi acha kiya, Vishal nahi acha kiya, so therefore let me give them something. Now, doing good or doing bad is something that actually gets recorded in your subconscious, in your parasympathetic nervous system, etc., etc., and it changes the way you look at yourself. It changes the way you interact with yourself. So I do believe those things play a part. We were talking about where mind sciences is progressing today. Hopefully, we'll have answers to all of this in the next 5 to 8 years, man. And that's something I'm really looking forward
to. So your take on destiny is that it just, you believe in destiny.
I do believe in destiny the way I define it. The way, my operational definition of destiny is a little different, but I do believe in my version of destiny. Look, it's destiny that you and I are here today, Vishal, right? It is destiny. It is not design. You and I might not have met while you were here in Singapore. We might not have met when I was there. Between the time we started talking about this podcast and now, you could have gotten COVID, I could have gotten COVID, right? And we would not have been having this conversation. There is chance, there is randomness because of which this is actually happening, But I don't think we can rule that out.
And given that, you are doing so many things, where do you see yourself 10, 20, 30 years down the line, with all the projects you are doing? Where is your destination?
Are yaar, this is a very tough conversation. I'll tell you why it's a tough conversation.
Well, we are not having tough conversations. We are just having generic conversation.
No, I'll tell you, when I say tough conversation, I'll tell you why. You see, ideas like legacy and immortality come at a kind of a cost, right? When people are working towards a destination or target, ki, hey, I need this, I need that, blah, 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 what you're essentially doing is you're trading off your present for the future, right? You're saying, I'm going to give up on A, B, C, D, E today because I need to be somewhere 5 years, 10 years from now, right? Now, 10 years from then, you're again giving up, E, F, G, H because you need to be somewhere else 5 years from then, so on and so forth. I'm a big fan of living in the present. I'm a big fan of being very comfortable that I don't need to have a legacy. I don't need to be, remembered. I don't need to be relevant or any of that stuff, right? Who knows, man? 5 or 10 years from now, you and I could be selling pakoras in Goa, and be totally happy doing that. Who knows? Why do we look for predictability? As far as you know that you are maximizing yourself right now for yourself and for people to who you matter. That's all there is, man. Right now, Vishal, there's you, there's me, and there's this podcast. Nothing else.
And I think that's the most amazing part of you, Anurag. You can simplify things so very well, whether it's the idea of doing things for yourself, whether it's the idea of living in the present, and whether it's the idea of taking something as complex as data and presenting it in the most relevant way. I'm so happy and proud to know you personally. And I'm happy that we got a chance to do this conversation so that people around who are listening to this podcast also got a small slice of knowing you. And of course, given all the things you are up to, we will continue this conversation and we will get you back for yet another discussion. But for now, once again, thanks a lot for being on the show. I for sure enjoyed every moment of this and I got to learn so many things. Thank you once again.
And Vishal, thank you for actually hosting this podcast. I hope you stay well. I hope you stay happy, and I hope you stay yourself.
Absolutely. I will be staying up myself. Yeah.
But that's a message for everybody. I mean, as far as you can discover yourself and be yourself, be true to yourself. That's all that matters. But it's an absolute joy. I'm missing pizza for this, and it's absolutely worth it.
No. Once again, thanks a lot.
I hope you enjoyed that show. If you aren't following us on social media, please do. We're IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. I'd like to thank the sponsors on the network this week, Cred, thewholetruthfoods.com, and Siet Tires. We really do appreciate the support. So the last year's been tough for all of us, and the second wave of COVID really hit us badly. To help those affected by the pandemic in India, the podcasting community has come together under the Pod for Change banner to raise funds through an exclusive NGO partner, Give India. Join IVM and Pod for Change as we look to make a positive impact in the life of those affected by COVID-19. You can go to tinyurl.com/podforchangeindia, and remember, somebody could really use the help. And now back to the promo. On the Simplified podcast, the gang explains the oxygen crisis happening in the country and tells us the various measures being taken to tackle it. On States of Anarchy, Hamsani Hariharan talks about how the geopolitical relationships shaped COVID response and the world order. As Indians, we're all familiar with acid reflux or heartburn, given the spicy food we consume. On The Habit Coach, Ashton has some simple solutions to counter that. Osama Moria explores the iconic neighborhood of Dadar and tells us its connection to outer space in Postcards from Nowhere. It was Dangle time on The Fighting Goat, as hosts Somesh and Arjun were joined by unbeaten MMA fighter and Commonwealth gold medalist Ritu Fogart. The traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh shares examples of various innovations that came up during the COVID times and helped us deal with the situation. And with that, we hope to see you again next week.
We live in an age of disruption, of immense change in every aspect of work, life, and business. But is the old way of doing things truly dead? And are we ever going to stop saying the new normal? Join me, Varun Dugirala, on Advertising is Dead every Tuesday as I talk to entrepreneurs, leaders, creators, and change makers from across business, media, marketing, and beyond to dig a little deeper into how we got here, what we're doing now, and where we're headed. You can catch all the episodes of Advertising is Dead on the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever you get your podcast from.